try to live in ways that leave as much room as possible for you to grow. Don't foreclose growing. Be ready for there to be more richness and depth to come. And as a corollary to that, always make room for other people to grow also.
Before we dive into this episode, I want to invite you to live, learn, love, and age healthier, happier, stronger, and longer, authentically. Why knowledge matters. Welcome, I'm Yannick, your host, and now joining me, A.K.M Adam. A.K.M Adam is a priest of the Church of England and joins me now to discuss his essay about sensuous hermeneutics. I'm so pleased to welcome you on the show, Dr. Adam.
Well, I'm very delighted to be here. I'll talk about hermeneutics at the drop of a hat. So this opportunity is always going to be welcome.
That's beautiful. But first and foremost, we want to know in simply one sentence, who is Dr. Adam?
Dr. Adam is an old academical clergyman who spends a lot of time listening to rock and roll and thinking about why people interpret books and music and art and gestures in the ways that they do.
Beautiful. And now, of course, we come really to what you have written, and that is really an essay about sensuous hermeneutics.
Yep.
But before we really dive into the material, what brought you to study hermeneutics in particular and theology in general?
In general, I started studying theology as preparation for being ordained. I, somewhat to my surprise and very much to my wife's surprise, was invited to participate in a series of retreats that were oriented towards helping young people find their vocation in life, with special attention to people who might be clergy of the future. And I went along blithely, not expecting anything. I was working in computer graphics at the time. And the selection board at the end of the retreat series suggested that I might be a good candidate to be a priest. And I thought that sounded wild. I thought that sounded like a very exciting and unanticipated possibility for me. I read philosophy as an undergraduate, and in my last year, a friend of mine, another philosopher, and I were thinking that it would be a great thing if towns had a philosopher on the civil payroll to stroll through the parks, sit in the sun, say wise things, give people advice if they needed it, propose ethical ways of looking at problems. And at one point, I told the retreat leader about this dream we had had, and she said, "Oh, you mean like being a priest?" And honestly, it had never occurred to me till that point that what we'd been thinking about was the same thing, just transposed into another disciplinary key. So when she put it that way, it sounded like just exactly what I'd been preparing for, except that I'd been reading philosophy instead of theology. So I had to do some catching up. And I did that in the context of being trained for ordination to ministry. And when I was training, I found that although I was a somewhat casual student at the undergraduate level, there were times when people applauded me for entering the library. They thought that I might go all the years of my undergraduate degree without ever entering the library. But I found myself, when I was studying for ordination, not just reading everything that was suggested, but following up the footnotes and looking up other things. And well, if that's the way it is, then maybe we should, and so on and so forth. I thrived on that subject matter. And the particular problems that most engaged my attention and excited me were problems relative to how it is that people arrive at different conclusions when they interpret texts, mostly texts at that point, because most people go about with an intuition that texts have meaning as a property. You may remember a few years ago, Jerry Seinfeld had a moment of re-emerging into popular attention doing a bit on one of the late night shows about donut holes. And he said, there's no such thing as a donut hole because by definition, a donut is round and the thing in the middle is nothing. So he would say, words have meaning. You can't call a little orb of dough a hole. Most people operate with that intuition. He wasn't challenging people to think differently about the nature of interpretation. He was relying on people to assent to the idea words have meaning. And if that's true, we have problems when multiple different people, say you and I, look at words and arrive at divergent conclusions. But that's what people have been doing with texts for as long as there have been texts to read and interpret. So most people who study hermeneutics, especially in the biblical fields, try to figure out the right way of arriving at the meaning that subsists in text on the premise that as Jerry Seinfeld said, words have meaning. I propose that words don't have meaning as a subsistent property, as a feature, an aspect of the nature of wordness. Rather, we use words to convey meaning, but the words we use don't have meaning as their constituent ingredients. So that the divergent conclusions that people arrive at for interpretation arise not because you're understanding the true meaning that is latent in a set of words, and I'm mistakenly substituting some idle fancy of my own, but because we're responding to the same cues differently because we're different people. And we would go a long ways to understand interpretation better and interpretive conflict better if we set aside the idea that words have meaning that we might get right, or contrariwise, that someone else gets wrong. Only rarely does someone writing about the nature of interpretation say, I'm totally wrong about this text. It's hard to think what that would mean. If you're reading it, making some sense of it, then you must think that to some extent you're right about the interpretation you're arriving at. So people seek out the way of arriving at the right interpretation that's a justification of the conclusion they've already reached. I want to set all of that aside and say, I think this is the best interpretation for these reasons. And you might then respond, but for these reasons, this is a better interpretation. And if I am impressed with your reasons, I'll say, whoa, yes. Or if I'm unimpressed with your reasoning, I might politely say, oh, that's very interesting, Mr. Mueller. Or I might get angry with you and argue, but at least we would know that we're arguing about the reasons, the relative priority of aspects of the text that we're arguing about, instead of the nature of the meaning inside the text. Does that make a degree of sense to you?
Yeah. Very interesting, yeah. And of course, it also poses the question then, what meaning in and of itself is. When, as you said, that words do not have intrinsic meaning, but it's to some extent what I understand, it's the meaning we give to them, and then through this we can interpret the text accordingly to our way of looking at the text and the world.
Yes. A helpful way of getting at the absence of meaning, and by that I don't mean that nothing means anything or you can make anything mean anything, but that there isn't a regulative function in a word or an utterance, a sentence, that makes one way of construing it the right one. But one way of getting at this is to think, if you were going to print as a publisher a copy of the Bible, would you print it in Comic Sans? Now the answer is no, no one would ever do that, because you wouldn't be able to sell enough copies to make it worthwhile. There's something about the use of one particular typeface that seems discordant, and you sense appropriately that readers would not want to read the Bible in a comical children's handwriting kind of typeface. Now, all the words would be the same, but you wouldn't be able to persuade people to buy it if it were set in Comic Sans. Likewise, if I were to read the Bible aloud to you, I could take all the words that one imagines in the Bible, one reads in the Bible, and inflect them with my voice in untoward ways. So I might say, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, or something along those lines. Again, all the words would be the same if you were doing a voice recognition, assuming the software could make out what I was saying, it would report all the biblical words. But the way I used my voice would be implying a sort of disrespectful, skeptical tone, again, discordant with the way that most people read the Bible. And the appropriate interpretation of my rude reading of the beginning of John's Gospel would be, this is a loutish boor who is making fun of the biblical text. But again, I would only be reading the words that were there. Now, where is the characteristic of boorishness, rudeness? Well, it's in the tone, but we don't have a way of conveying tone in a printed text. And if we were relying on a printed text, if say it were just the text of an interview, the transcript of an interview like this, someone might say, well, he just said, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. What's disrespectful about that? Do you see the direction I'm taking this? The meaning isn't a function of the words themselves, but of the interaction that we have as two people who speak English and who understand ways of expressing utterances in English, or ways of depicting utterances in typography. And we try to match the way we present our utterances to a response we expect people to make. And it's a very tactical decision. This is why we spend a lot of time trying to decide whether to use one word or another in composing text carefully, prose carefully. Is this more of this kind or that kind of situation? Because we want people to apprehend from our use of words what it is that we're trying to express. But the meaning arises from the interaction, not from a subsistent quality within the words.
Yeah, that makes absolutely sense. I mean, that's why also the word sensuous, right? That you
Yes.
added to it, first, and then sensuous hermeneutics, which then obviously changes completely.
Yeah, the point of that essay is that if we think about interpretation as something we do with all our senses all the time, and acknowledge that, again, if you and I were walking down the street in Abingdon-on-Thames, where I live, we would be noticing different things. We might disagree about what color something is. We might hear different things differently. And in so doing, we wouldn't be ignoring or necessarily arguing about the real meaning of the storefront or the music that someone is playing. Rather, we would just be apprehending it differently appropriately, because we're rather different people. You're young and good looking, I'm old and plain, and we would reach different interpretive conclusions, but it would not necessarily mean that one of us is wrong and one of us is right. Does that fit?
This makes absolutely sense. Now, one of the problems in a specific context like you are in, you're an academic who thinks deeply about those kind of things, which really have huge implications for for our lives, of course. But then, how how do we avoid that we ultimately go into a relativism, whether it's moral relativism or cultural relativism or any other type of relativism that is not conducive for the betterment of humanity. And of course, I think the Bible, in and of itself, is about the truth, and that the truth, in one way or another, can be dissected and deciphered. I think that was Abraham. I think I think Robbie Sachs even said that the very beginning of actually the science, like modern science, was when Abraham basically, or the Jews back then, realized that, well, there's actually only one God. Therefore, there is at least an objective truth that we can potentially one day, um, find, or
Yeah, I would respond that under the conditions of mortality, uh, we always only have relative criteria for assessing truth or morality or whatever. But I hasten to add that the criteria in question may be relative to a vast swath of humanity. Um, but for instance, if we were to take cannibalism as a case in point, the number of people who would be troubled by the claim um, cannibalism is intrinsically immoral and nobody should eat human flesh. The number of people who would think, no, that's not right, is vanishingly small. We don't need to worry about, well, we need to worry about them because they're likely to be cannibals, but we don't need to worry about winning an argument with them. We just say, no, you are cannibals, and we are not going to put you in a position where you might kill and eat other human beings because we can't trust you. If you think that's morally good, then we don't want to allow you the latitude to exercise that judgment. But there are no situations that come to mind where you could get everybody on board to say, this is an unequivocally universal human norm for morality. That being the case, we then need to acknowledge that my claims are relative to a Christian tradition of teaching, which says that ultimately these claims are justified by the judgment of God, as all things are brought into alignment with God's governing will, so that we can say, well, you may choose to be a cannibal and we'll confine you, banish you, in some other way seek to prevent you from eating us. and that you will be confronted with the wrongness of your outlook and conduct in the end. But for temporal purposes, we don't have traction on the cannibal's moral judgment that in a way that would oblige them to say, oh, golly, I guess you're right. I've got to give up eating people. So that the relativism, the relative status of a ban on cannibalism isn't unsatisfactory because there are so many people who hold to it and so few people who would want to resist it, that we can get along fine treating it as a universal. But that still doesn't justify our saying somehow that we had proved it, or that in the nature of humanity, existence, whatever, this is an intrinsic moral law. We can say it's a revealed law. God has revealed it to us. Sadly, God seems not to have revealed it equally to everyone. Again, as long as there is someone who eats human flesh, then we can't claim that that's a universal. But the whole world is not slipping towards cannibalism. We don't need to worry about the relativity of that law because practically everyone adheres to it. The only time we need to worry, the only time we get into conflicts over the relativity of judgments are when there are in fact large numbers of people who hold to a moral or interpretive criterion or axiom that we disagree with. But in that case, saying ours is universal and the 40% of people who think that it's not universal, that something else is universal, are clearly wrong. Saying it's universal doesn't advance anything because 40% of people don't accept the claim anyway. Am I making this moderately clear anyway?
Yeah.
So I don't think we need to worry about relativism. We deal with the relative limitations of language and ethics about as well as we possibly can. And by invoking relativism as a fearful threat, we're suggesting a hypothetical that doesn't really enter into the case of actual people actually dealing with one another.
Now, how can sensuous hermeneutics help in bridging the gap between people, for example, who read the same text, the same, let's say, gospel, and then somehow find truly, a bridge in which they can and somehow understand one another?
Because once we step beyond saying, this is what that means, full stop, and say, it seems to me that it means this for these reasons. Now we've got something we can argue about, the reasons. The text assuming we're looking at the same translation of the Bible, or we are blessed with the capacity to read in Greek and Hebrew, and we're looking at a good text of the original languages. Either way, we can agree on what the words say. That's the easy part. But what to make of them is much more complicated. It's not the same as agreeing what the individual words are. And what we need to talk about then is the reasons you interpret Luke's gospel this way, and I interpret Luke's gospel differently. And we may not come to an agreed understanding at that point, but we may attain a point where I understand your rationale and you understand my rationale, even though we don't adopt the other's perspective. And that's at least a gesture toward patience and mutual respect and endeavoring to attain agreement on things we might agree about. If we're trying to ascertain the right meaning, the right intrinsic meaning of words, and there isn't an intrinsic meaning back there, then we're never going to be able to get the thing we want because it's not there, it's not available to us. But if we say, Mr. Mueller, why do you interpret things that way, this passage that way? You may say, because it comes from a Greek context and other Greek thinkers used these technical terms in these ways, and it's picking up those ways. And now that's great. We can have a lovely conversation about Greek philosophy and the extent to which it permeates New Testament thought and so on indefinitely. And those are the reasons you're arriving at a conclusion that might differ from mine. Let's talk about the reasoning, not about a non-existent, hypothetical, real meaning that's in the text. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's where we truly start learning from each other and trying to start building a more peaceful and fruitful society. And of course, it starts in the very, academia, right? Where
Well,
these kind of things.
I wouldn't give academia too much credit, but you asked at the outset why sensuous hermeneutics is especially propitious for this, and to answer that specific part of the question, I would say, I would ask you, what is the correct interpretation of, let's say, Gloria, the song popularized by them, led by Van Morrison? Is it the recording that Van Morrison made with them in the 60s, or does Patti Smith correctly apprehend it as a component in her song, Gloria, interspersed with her somewhat anti-theological rhetoric? The question is kind of silly when you put it that way. Van Morrison's version is great. The kids can dance to it. Patti Smith's is fantastic, cutting and gripping in a way that Van Morrison's is more, it's propulsive, but more innocent in a way. But to try to adjudicate which is the right meaning of the song Gloria is a fruitless exercise. There's no more rightness to an interpretation of Gloria than there is to an interpretation of Tom Sawyer. Not today's Tom Sawyer by Rush, but the novel by Mark Twain I was thinking of. What's the right smell for a freshly baked loaf of bread? What's the right color for a tie? Rightness isn't a feature of your tie, although it looks like a handsome tie from here. Nice jacket, but there isn't a right color or right pattern that inheres in the fabric that has been cut and sewn into the clothing that you're wearing. It's what you opted to wear when you got dressed in preparation for the day. What's the right interpretation of greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends? Well, it would depend on what the circumstances are. Right now, none of my friends seems particularly to be in peril. Does that mean I should go running around the streets of Abingdon trying to find an opportunity to be killed that would benefit my friends? I don't think that's catching it. But at the same time, it would seem odd to suggest that the right interpretation of this verse from John's Gospel is, don't worry about it, you've got other things to do. And especially in a world in which people are being massacred at this very moment, it calls into question the complacency with which I sit in a room in Abingdon-on-Thames talking on my computer with an esteemed colleague in Canada, I believe. Mm-hmm. So the right meaning is going to be an effect that arises from expression, from the way things are apprehended, from circumstances, but not from having the right meaning of something that's intrinsic in words, any more than the right smell is intrinsic in a loaf of bread, or the right color is intrinsic in a tie. Trying to think of other senses. Oh, well, I mean, the right way of touching someone is intrinsic in the touch. I might touch two people in the same way, but if one of them's my wife and one of them isn't, the ostensibly same physical contact could be horribly wrong in one case and pleasantly positive in another. So we need to get over the idea that words are a special case that have an interpretive law built into them, and think of them more in terms of sheet music or a way of baking bread or a design for a tie, things along those lines. And that's why I appeal to sensuous hermeneutics, that recognizing that interpretation is something we do with all our senses, so that our textual interpretation should be more like our gustatory interpretation or our audio interpretation, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's really about the humility that you really also put forward, between our understanding and the fact that there is no, in this sense, objective truth, because there is always a subjective way through which you look at the world.
But not all subjectivities are the same. This is the important part. If you've got a subjectivity that's shared by 98% of humanity, or even 80% of humanity, that's a pretty good, solid subjectivity there. And although you want to pay attention to the 20% who don't share it, you also don't have to go through life worrying about maybe nothing means anything. Oh no, because that problem doesn't arise except in certain limited circumstances. And you can know roughly what those circumstances are. And if those circumstances arise, you can deal with them. You don't need to say, sorry, I treat every circumstance exactly the same way. And because I'm an 80%er, I'm just going to ignore you, the 20% person, because your opinion doesn't count. Does that help clarify what I'm proposing?
Absolutely. I think what you're saying, in my view, is that it truly helps in bringing people together and forging an understanding between them. But you are not saying that there are not, let's say, for example, human identity needs or fundamental or universal human identity needs that we cannot agree with. I think that is clear. There are some fundamentals that we all share. That is the bottom line. These are the common denominators. They we can actually see, but the way in which we interpret specifically, for example, text, we have to realize that sensuous hermeneutics is crucial in order to understand the other point of view, which ultimately to some extent decreases the veil of judgment, which ultimately clouds our understanding of the other's interpretation. Does this somehow, what would you say to this?
That sounds right, except I just wouldn't use the word all in some of the cases you did. Because
Good point.
again, uh, I, I just I don't know enough people to say all people agree about this or this is fundamental for everyone. Um, it seems likely that it would be, but if someone wants to come along and say, well, it's not fundamental for me, in the first instance, I don't want to argue with that person.
Exactly.
And in the second instance, if it's true of everybody else that I know, then although I may think, oh, so it's not fundamental for Mr. Mueller, I'll remember that and I won't get him a birthday present that involves this non-fundamental thing that he doesn't agree about. I'll just cope with life on the basis that there is one person for whom it's not fundamental. And that doesn't make me feel bad. I don't feel as though, oh, if I don't compel everyone to be on board with this, that it's not true enough. No, I think lots of things are true that other people don't, but it doesn't cause me to be fretful about that. If we get into an argument about it, fine. We can argue about the reasons I hold something to be true and the reasons they doubt it, and see where that leads us. But I don't need everyone always to be on the same page with everyone else.
Yeah, I think it's very important, and this is really enlightening because, of course, as you said, there is always a certain percentage that we cannot agree. But on the other hand, then there is always this fear too, and we are simply, our brain is just made first and foremost to make us survive, right? And there's always this fear that overtakes us, right? And then there is this fear that, well, because it's one thing of saying, yes, there are a few people who might think that way, but the majority still isn't this way. But it's another thing then if you are fearful that this small majority wants to ultimately object or force the majority to believe something in one way or another way, right? And this can apply, you know, whether in a biblical context, for example. And I'm wondering, because I'm certainly that you there is a lot of debate within academia, and I think you might have had some backlash in the way in which you see and interpret a biblical text.
Oh, sure. Um, uh, and there are many people who want not just to have good reasons for the claims they make, but they want to be able to grab you by the lapels and say, but I'm right. I'm right about this. But that's not a question about the text. That's a question about power, about who can make other people behave in certain ways. And to be candid, there are some people, maybe a lot of people, but I wouldn't go there. There are some people who get into the professional field of biblical interpretation specifically because they want to be able to arrive at right answers that they can make you live with. But I don't want to force other people to adopt things just because I said so. That would be a very, very peculiar world, Mr. Mueller. I think that nobody wants to live in a world where I set the terms. But I'm very happy to live in a world where people consider things I say, the way I say it, and my offer of a different way of looking at possibilities, and decide whether that in fact makes better sense of their lives than the basis that they've been going forward on. And a lot of people in biblical studies want to hold on to that I can be right in a regulative way impulse. I just don't think it's necessary. I don't go around trying to prove the functioning of gravity all the time. I walk on the pavement. I do not walk off the edge of a tall building because I'm pretty confident that gravity would have deleterious effects on my health when I reach the bottom. But if someone wanted to argue that they didn't accept the principle of gravity, I wouldn't put a lot of energy into persuading them they were wrong. I would say, curious that you seem to stay on the ground a lot, but if you want to devise some other explanation for it, maybe you've got Velcro on your shoes or glue, or in comics, frequently people will attach plungers, vacuum plungers to their shoes so that they can ostensibly walk on ceilings. And whatever explanation you may have, it doesn't worry me. So I believe I'm right about lots of things, and other people can say, no, no, no. All right, doesn't worry me. I will speak up for what I take to be what we might say politically right in human life together. I will speak up for what I take to be theologically right in church life, but I will do so not in the name of you have to believe this, or you have to accept this, or come to terms with it because I have police authority or something along those lines. I would say, listen, me and 80% of my friends really think that we'd just as soon live in a world where all races have equal opportunities and we recognize that that hasn't always been the case. So in order to make it functional now, we need to do extra work to remedy the harms done that inhibit this equality of possibility. Now other people will say, no, 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 every individual on their own, no reparations, no remediation. Now we can talk about why. I think that person is very wrong, but we can talk about reasons. But I won't hesitate to say, you're wrong about that. I'll just say, and this is why. Do you see that as in some way consistent with the approach that I've been discussing?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And of course, it's also to some extent a nuanced approach. But of course, but it's also very important um, in a scholarly context. Let's say in interpreting the let's say the Bible and the words is obviously is a different dimension than in a more social political context, right? But still, the principle that you laid forward with um, sensuous hermeneutics still apply. And
Yeah.
so my yeah, and
No,
so
go
my
ahead.
yeah,
I
so
was
my
just agreeing with you. You're a very
okay,
insightful man.
okay. But what I find very interesting, and I want to know is how did your study and your insight of sensuous hermeneutics change and help you in living your life, but also at the personal level, but also at an academic level. And I want to start with your academic and your career, and then I want to transition to your more personal life.
Um, well, it didn't do much for my career. I've had a number of uh, very rewarding, very satisfying posts, most particularly the one I occupy now, where I tutor for New Testament students at Oriel College at Oxford. Um, uh, Lovely, sharp-edged students who are um, thoughtful and critical, don't necessarily believe things just because I tell them, which is excellent. But at various church-related institutions in the past, um, every new term I fall in love with more students, not in a dangerous way, not in a safeguarding way, but just the students who want to learn about all this stuff. It's very touching to me that something that I care about so much, they trust me to help them learn about. So that's been tremendous. Now, as I say, I haven't been vaulted to the highest reaches of academic prominence by this. One of the difficulties with this approach, when I'm not talking specifically about the essay that you are discussing, I refer to it more as differential hermeneutics, hermeneutics that accepts and works with difference. One of the consequences of adhering to a differential hermeneutic is that um, nobody gets to claim you as the person who justifies their particular position. So I'm not useful to other people in the same way as if I said, well, this has been proved conclusively that the author of John's Gospel was a Greek who didn't know much about Judaism and was full of Stoic epistemology or something along those lines. And then the next person can say, as Adam has demonstrated, and so on and so forth. That kind of move renders you more useful in the academic give and take in your field, but saying, well, Adam explains why we disagree about this stuff, but I'm right anyway, or something along those lines. It doesn't really do much. So it doesn't build alliances. It doesn't impress people as the foundation that they can build their academic empire on, or something along those lines. So although I'm pretty good at the teaching part of things, I think, my career as a research scholar has been, well, the streets. Do you remember original pirate material from, oh golly, it will have been about 20 years ago now, UK garage music? Is this ringing a bell? Or do you have
No,
more
not really.
elevated tastes?
No, 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 no.
Mike Skinner from the Streets, at one point in the track "Let's Push Things Forward," refers to himself as cult classic, not bestseller, and that's I'm more of a cult classic than the Hollywood big stars in biblical studies. If you've come across my work, then you might think, oh yeah, that guy's really kind of cool. But you wouldn't think, oh my God, I got to meet ACMA, or something along those lines. So as far as academic careers go, I've had a lovely academic career, but modest. And that's probably just as well, I suppose. As far as church career, well, the church runs hot and cold on academics. So some people are excited about me and the theological implications of what I teach. And other people are not so sure. Again, there are a lot of people in the church who want to be able to say, the Bible says this, so you have to do it. Rather than, well, I see these words in the Bible, and it makes most sense to me to live my life this way in accordance with them, but allow for the possibility that someone else might see it differently. Personally, it's tricky. I've never tried to live by someone else's theology or philosophy. My understanding of my sort of moral intuitions and theological intuitions and philosophical intuitions has gotten sharper as I've read more and more, as I've tried out ideas and found one or another to be a blind alley, reel it back, start again, try a different way of thinking about it. But my way of life, at least since early adulthood, has been oriented towards patience. Not everything happens all at once. Not everything is available all at once. Not everything is coming to me anyway. So just be patient. In Glasgow, my friends would say, if it's for you, it'll no go by you. That's fine with me. And humility, and now this may be because I'm a mediocre scholar, and I'm just being humble because, as a matter of fact, I can't afford to be vain. But I'm aware that I am vain anyway to myself, and I work at ratcheting down the temptation to think of myself more highly than I should. How successfully I do that, I leave it to others to judge. But um, I'm oriented more towards listening, trying to understand other people, trying to tease out the implications of things we can agree on, um, things that are not in conflict, than trying to use force to resolve a conflict um, that, that might not be worth the effort or the cost in terms of force. Sometimes getting things your way is more harmful to all concerned, including yourself. And so I'd rather not. I'd rather sit tight, wait, make my case. I'm not going to stop exhorting and proposing and reasoning, but I'm also not going to twist any arms if I can avoid it. Um, and that's a way of life that I think suits me. I recommend it. I think that we see in the world too many people who are too ready to use too much force to compel other people to do their will. And I have no interest in that. I would like to persuade people to do things that I think are in our mutual interest, but I don't want to use force. I'm not that important.
Well, it's beautiful because what you are just showing me is truly a man, obviously, of wisdom, which is so necessary in this world. And I think wisdom comes only, by and large, through experience. And I can truly
Well,
tell
I've
that.
got a lot of that. uh,
Exactly.
60 plus years of experience embedded there, and um, uh, looking forward to a few more.
Well, hopefully, of course, for the world too. And what I can really also hear too is you're truly a man of service in a genuine sense. You know.
Well, part of one of the consequences of the things I've been saying is that I want to put the things I'm good at the disposal of people for whom that those gifts would be useful. And again, not to um, force other people to say they have to accept me or make use of me or anything like that, nor to say the things I think or the things I think I'm good at are binding and obligatory. But if I can be useful, if people do learn their Greek or learn about ways of reading the New Testament more richly and more deeply, more different dimensions to their understanding, then I'm happy to help that's very rewarding.
Yeah, that's beautiful, and you truly show me that it's really a journey, and there is also a reconciliation, of course, that anyone has to do with him or herself. If from unconscious to a conscious, and bring this together and become more holy in this sense. And I think it's beautiful that you illustrate this in the way in which you talk, but also in my feeling that you also truly live that, right? That you contribute truly to this.
Well, I hope you're right. It would be very gratifying for that to be true. I don't take it for granted, and sometimes I'm short-tempered. Sometimes, sometimes there are things that I really want the church to do or other people to do, and I may push too hard. But I try to um, live in a way that's um, that involves building on consent and assent and mutuality. Um, that, it seems to me, is more likely to last more, to do more good for more people. And if some desires of mine or some goals of mine aren't met, um, maybe it's better that I be a little disappointed, but to not be the cause of someone else being annoyed at that fellow with a beard who's pushing to the front and trying to boss people around. I wouldn't want that.
I think what's so beautiful, you really illustrate how important also to you is trust. You know that you don't want to ultimately cancel the trust, because trust is so hard to actually build but so easy to actually destroy it. And without trust, especially in such a sophisticated landscape we now live in, trust is really now the human currency almost. Because and that is truly, I'm so blessed that you stand for this.
And trust is antithetical to the use of force. If someone's trying to force me to do something, um, I can't trust them to be that it's in my interest or anyone else's interest. Um, so yes, absolutely, I'm very much, I cherish trust and want to go great distances to build trust and not to presume on it. I don't uh, I don't feel as though I have the prerogative to address people and say, look, trust me, I know what's best for you in these ways. But rather, I want to listen and to say, if what I'm hearing sounds right, if what I'm observing seems right, then it's at least possible, it seems to me, that this may be the case. Does that sound as though it's consonant with your perception of how things are going? Might it be best if we did things this way? Okay, if you say, um, you know, we don't have to, but the opportunity is there.
Beautiful. Coffee or tea?
I've tried to get aboard with tea. My wife is a tea drinker, but for me, it's it's coffee. It's black coffee, no sugar. I want to taste the the qualities of the beans themselves, and to benefit from the caffeine. But I recognize that I may be on a lower plane of existence than tea drinkers who have loftier, more refined palates. So uh, it uh, it is by God's grace that I am what I am, and I might be even worse. I'm not sure what's worse than a coffee drinker, but probably better if I not think about it. But I'm black coffee all the way.
Do you get up early?
Very early. I wake up most mornings around 5 o'clock. Before I'm fully awake, I put on my trainers and run for 2 miles every morning, come back, and then I have a cup of coffee, usually have some fruit for breakfast. 2 days a week I have hot breakfast. I'll make myself eggs, vegetarian bacon. I've finally found a brand of fake bacon, faux bacon, that reminds me enough of what bacon used to be like. Have some hash browns. Coffee, eggs, bacon, hash browns. That's a lovely breakfast. But other days, most days, 5 days a week, I have just fruit for breakfast and coffee. But yeah, I'm an early riser and I fall asleep early.
So, what does mean early for you in the evening?
Well, I start getting drowsy around 9 o'clock. I'm part of a gang of theologians. Now you may imagine a bunch of old people. We used to be young. We used to be young like you, but now we're all old and gray-haired. And we would get together every summer and with our families. And every summer after the children fell asleep, we would get out. I hope none of the children are listening to this. We would get out chocolate and salty treats, tortilla chips, crisps, pretzels, and we would just eat these snacks and stay up late, arguing about theological things, talking about basketball or other vital topics. And every night, I would be the first one to fall asleep, and it would be a somewhat comical development. People would keep an eye on me to see when I was beginning to start nodding, and finally, someone, Phil, probably, or Margaret, my wife, would say, "I think Agma's ready to go to bed now," and I would shuffle off, and everyone else would stay up, having a great time for another few hours, and I'd just be sleeping. That's me, early to bed, and then also early to rise. I don't know whether it's made me healthy. Has not made me wealthy. If someone wants to make me wealthy, by all means, get in touch with Yannick, and he'll put you in touch with me, and we'll work something out. Wise, who knows? My health is pretty good. Running 2 miles in the morning has been a good thing for me.
It's also interesting because you mentioned, your age, right? But how do you feel about now? I think there is obviously also like there is the physical decline, obviously, which starts with 21. In fact, the very beginning when the mother gives birth is basically closer to our death. But I think one thing I find also interesting isn't that there is something much more beautiful that is ultimately emerges while you going through life, and especially getting older, in the sense of having, maybe the spiritual growth that you experienced that you haven't when you were, in your 20s, for example.
Um, I have long thought about death as part of life, as it were. But when I get closer, I find that what I am thinking about death gets clearer. And although I'm not rushing toward it, I think I'm gradually better prepared for it. There's some stuff I want to get done. There's a book I want to finish writing about differential hermeneutics. I don't want to leave my wife bereft. I'm more confident in my capacity to get along without her by my side than her with mine. Now, that's partly a personality thing, but part of the reason that I exercise is to do the most I can to make sure that I'll be there for her as long as she's alive. I'd be excited to see my grandchildren grow up. But does the world really need a lot more of ACMA's time? Probably not. I've had my innings, you know. There are exciting new things for other biblical scholars to do, to forget that I was ever around. And the world will not be a significantly worse place. So I'm braced for that, but not in a rush.
Very good. I think you're just way too humble, but that's always, that comes with especially wisdom. That's what always the brightest always tell about themselves, right? And that is, to me, always the testimony that actually they are truly like the wisest and brightest. So yeah, so that's, we leave it there.
Okay.
So meaningful life. What is your number one advice to live a meaningful and a fulfilled life?
You said you were going to ask me, and I tried to think about it, and that's an extraordinarily difficult thing to comment on succinctly. And you've already recognized that I can go on at length, even on easy topics, much less on complicated ones. So I tried to narrow down my response. And what I came up with, I'm not sure I want to stick with this, but it's what I came up with in answer to you today, was to try to live in ways that leave as much room as possible for you to grow. Don't foreclose growing. Be ready for there to be more richness and depth to come. And as a corollary to that, always make room for other people to grow also. Don't foreclose other people's goodness, no matter how annoying or despicable you find them. They may have room to grow, and you don't want to be the one who limited their capacity to grow. So I'll say that, and I will stop, except to say maybe New York Yankees supporters would be a separate case. But for the rest, leave room to grow, leave room for others to grow. And
you cannot say this more beautiful, really. Leave space for growth, your personal and also for the interpersonal, for others, to truly grow. I really love that. I think that is so essential, and that's, I think, truly what the meaning of life is. What makes you feel alive?
We're between terms at Oxford. So I'm part-time in a parish church in Abington here, and part-time tutoring at Oxford. We're between terms at Oxford, which means I have more time than usual for research and writing. And I spent a fair amount of time in the last couple of days working on an essay that I'm writing. I'm not going to say what the subject is in case the editor is listening. or another editor is listening and saying, why isn't he working on the one he owes me? But reading sharp ideas, picking them up and letting them work on me, and then putting them to work towards the ideas that I want to express. That's fantastic. I love that. Margaret and I, my wife and I, have a way of talking about very clever, insightful people, and we say, the air crackles around her when she walks, because the intensity of her thinking is so electrifying. But catching a little bit of that in my own research and writing, that's great. And I would be remiss if I didn't also say, leading worship. I am, at the end of the day, a priest. And joining with the people of God in praise of God, leading our sacramental worship. I don't know if I would say it makes me feel alive, but it makes me feel as though I'm doing the thing I ought to be doing. Indeed, it makes me forget that I'm doing something at all, but that I'm caught up in the being of the congregation, the worship of the church. And I don't have good words for that, but
beautiful. Thank you so much, Dr. A.K.M Adam, to be here on the show. You're truly a blessing, to myself and the world. I know you're way too humble and it's adorable, but you just have to get out with it, because that's truly how I feel, right? And so, it's truly a blessing. Thank you so much. And you're truly a blessing for the world. And I can imagine for your congregation.
Well, I'm excited to be serving this church. I can see the steeple out the window just yonder. And I'm excited to be working with my students and colleagues at Oriel. It's a great thing. It's a great privilege. And I hope I'm doing well enough by them all. And you've taken an hour or more of your time and more when you consider the email exchanges and so on and so forth. I hope it's all been worthwhile for you.
Without question.
Well, great.
Dr. A.K.M Adam.
Buy my books on Amazon.
For sure. Thank you so much, Dr. A.K.M Adam.
Thank you, Yannick. It's been good to talk with you.
That's why knowledge matters. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.d-ykm.com.